getting settled in here, I want to thank everybody, first of all, for sticking around for the full day. I think we have a great panel here to finish us off. We've talked about a whole range of issues today, from economic development, terrorism, security, politics, a whole range of things. And now in the final panel, we're going to talk about Bangladesh and its relations with the neighborhood. And it lives in a particularly tough neighborhood. Very interesting, very strategically important these days. Here at ASP, one of the things we work on a lot is the impacts of energy and climate change on national security and global security. I've written previously about how the Bay of Bengal is a hotspot for climate insecurity. Shameless plug. Read it on our website or sustainablesecurity.org. And thinking about this today, we talked a lot about all these problems: economic development, terrorism, security, corruption. But when we talk about climate change and global warming, the interesting thing is it's not that a 2-degree change in temperature is that much of a security threat. It's how it impacts all these other issues. It's a ring road issue, a threat multiplier that impacts things like terrorism, things like security, things like international relations. It's not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily follow that changing from the climate of New York City to the climate of Boston is a security threat. That's a 2°C difference. But it does, because it affects all of these other issues. Now today, our panelists won't all speak only about climate change, but I thought it's an interesting addition to it as well. So with that, we're going to go straight into it. And we have 3 great panelists. Mahfouz Ullah is the Secretary General of the Center for Sustainable Development. Nalanthi Semaranakai, I'm sure I butchered that, I'm sorry, is an Asia analyst at the Center for Naval Analysis. And Elizabeth Ferris is the co-director of a Brookings LSE project on internal displacement. And with that, I'll turn it right over to Mahfouz. Thank you. And I would ask that all of you all please take notes, and because I'm going to ask you for good questions at the end. So.
You are trying to make our life difficult. Good afternoon, Mr. Moderator, distinguished participants. I feel honored to be invited here to speak on issues which are of great concern for Bangladesh especially, and also for her neighborhood. But what I will be saying here is based on my practical experience, because over the years I had the privilege of meeting a good number of intellectual elites, I would say call them, intellectual elites of the region, from whose knowledge and understanding I have, enriched my understanding of the situation. This is number one. Number two is to have a sort of a compromise between the jet lag and the time constraint. I have made a statement, prepared a statement, which I personally believe would help me in making my case much easier. And also, this is basically a statement based on day-to-day events, which I could gather in my professional life and also in my interactions. So I didn't go into the detailing out the events, but the outcome which these events contributed to making this statement, that I always keep it in mind. First, let's look at the regional political environment and cooperation, security implications, and the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, which is known as SAARC. South Asia on a broader mosaic extends from Afghanistan to China. Today, South Asia is considered volatile and explosive, and the strategic environment is conflict-ridden. The long-standing social and political cleavages along ideological, linguistic, ethnic lines in all the states have made the situation critical. It is a common challenge for South Asian countries to address social inequality, organized crime, corruption in public institutions and electoral arena, and the poor leadership that undermines the culture of democracy. Also, the agonizingly painful terror tactics engineered by highly organized militant groups are threatening the fabric of peace and stability in the region. Terrorism, extremism, and trans-border crimes have increased during the past decade, raising the level of mistrust and suspicions. The big India, being oversensitive to her security needs, has been pursuing the policy of non-reciprocity with professed objective of building a long-term support for itself in the region, which tend to alienate its small neighbors, for which some argue Indian foreign policy is guided by one of the tenets of philosopher Chanakya that says, your neighbor is your enemy. The small neighbors of India desire to see multilateral framework as envisaged in SAARC in operation, where they can sit together to discuss, deliberate, and resolve collectively. Most of India's small neighbors do resent India's bilateralism. The resolution of all outstanding issues between India and her neighbors calls for a blending of mutual trust and goodwill. India would ignore reciprocity in her relations with Bangladesh, Bhutan, the Maldives, Nepal, and Sri Lanka, but could give and accommodate what it can in good faith. The Indo-Bangladesh relations. Bangladesh is effectively India-locked and has China and India, two Asian heavyweights, as her neighbors. She has 3 out of 7 declared nuclear weapon states in her neighborhood. The situation has been compounded because of acts of terrorism perpetrated by numerous radical and separatist groups operating in the region. Water remains South Asia's most crucial and contested natural resource because most of its waterways are interstate. The positive aspect of Bangladesh's location is the access to the Bay of Bengal and through it to the Middle East and Southeast Asia. Also, she does have a fair degree of importance for India since the two countries share a long and complicated land boundary, and India's 7 sister states are located in the northeast of Bangladesh. India is one of the large trade partners of Bangladesh. Our trade volume with India is about 15% of our global trade. However, Bangladesh has a huge trade deficit with India, but the huge informal trade between India and Bangladesh is presumably equal to that of the formal trade. Some years back, in 2004, the World Bank said that informal trade of Bangladesh with India is 3/4 of Bangladesh's formal trade with India. Regardless of the close proximity between Bangladesh and India during the War of Liberation in 1971, the relations have sometimes been characterized by uneasiness and tension. On its part, India needs to take tangible measures in the light of its assurances to Bangladesh given during the last 4.5 years of the present regime. Otherwise, no government in future in Bangladesh will be able to change the mindset and perception of people about India. Bangladeshis in most cases feel the relationship between Bangladesh and India should be based on the words of Albert Camus, quote, "Don't walk behind me, I will not lead. Don't walk in front of me, I will not follow. Just walk beside me and be my friend." Now let's have a look at China's relationship with Bangladesh. China shares its border with 4 of the South Asian countries, and her relationships with South Asian countries have long been security-centric. There was a time when South Asia ranked relatively low in China's overall strategic interests compared with Asia. Today, China is looking for a more proactive role because of South Asia's emerging market, particularly India. China's expanding economic and trade interests in this region make South Asia looming larger in China's strategic configuration. Nevertheless, China has more interest in gaining access to West Asia than her neighbors. China has developed enthusiasm in multilateral diplomacy and is trying to assert its position in the global power game, having ramifications for South Asian countries. China's attempt to expand economic ties with South Asia include different measures, but she is enjoying trade surplus in its trade with South Asian countries. China's policy in South Asia is characterized by broad-based interests and engagements, achieving improved relationship through regional economic integration and interdependence on a quest for a win-win relationship with all South Asian countries. China's priority of East in strategic calculations face the challenges of trade deficit with India, US's strategy towards China, and lack of infrastructure in South Asia. This creates a more complex, uncertain, and challenging phase of China's foreign policy. The other reality is India and Japan are collaborating with the United States in this region. The events of South Asia are heavily influenced by these countries. This dynamic process is going on as a competitive phase of China's foreign policy, and this competition is not limited to security only. It is also in terms of economic and strategic interests. Relationship between Bangladesh and China, though considered age-old, took a different turn since China extended diplomatic recognitions to Bangladesh after the change of 15th August 1975. Initially, it was problematic for Bangladesh to reorient the army from its dependence on Indo-Russian equipment and armaments to Chinese defense equipment. Interestingly, the switchover was quite fast and smooth, and since then, both economic and military cooperation between China and Bangladesh has grown steadily. But the latest decision by the Bangladesh government to purchase defense equipment and nuclear power station from Russia has been a matter of concern for a number of friends of Bangladesh, including China. Trade volume of Bangladesh with China is by and large the same as with India. In recent years, India surpassed China in its formal trade with Bangladesh, and in some years, China surpassed India. While China's economic support to Bangladesh has been on the rise, but she is bidding to get the contract for deep sea port, more bridges over mighty rivers, expansion of road link between Dhaka and Kunming through Myanmar, and docking facilities in the under construction submarine station. These are some of the major issues to affect the Bangladesh-China relationship. Relationship with China is very important for Bangladesh for its own economic development and interests, but at the same time, Bangladesh faces pressures from US and other development partners for ensuring democracy, good governance, safeguarding human rights, and from India for containing extremism, providing trade corridor, securing access to Bay of Bengal, and survival of a government more supportive of India. Now let's come to climate change. Bangladesh is facing an additional challenge of the gradual global warming that is clearly taking place. As Bangladesh contributes almost nothing to global warming, we can do very little to ameliorate this problem. If the worst were to happen and sea levels were to rise so that 10% or more of our land mass were lost, we would be in a world where there would be significant population movements all around. Climate change impacts adversely in the areas of human security, which include human rights, natural disasters, development, health, poverty, water availability, food security, and contributes to increase in number of weak and fragile states. Climate change would contribute to a rise in the level of Bay of Bengal, approximately consuming about 10% of land area of Bangladesh by saline water. There are differences of opinion about this figure. Some say it's 10%, some say it's 17%. IPCC is also not sure about what would be the, but in any case, 10% is the bottom line. Against this backdrop, Bangladeshis would not be waiting in the coastal areas. They would move. So would the people in Mumbai, Chennai, and possibly London. This would create a major security problem, physical and political. Bangladesh would have to face the consequences of both internal and external migration. This demographic movement would cause Indian irritation. Besides, about 50,000 people of Bangladesh are directly involved in salt production using salt water of the Bay of Bengal. About 120,000 people are involved in fishing in the coastal areas of the country. Today, Bay of Bengal is also termed a large marine ecosystem. Bangladesh, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, Maldives, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, and Thailand are the countries bordering the LEB. Countries bordering the Bay of Bengal are claiming themselves stakeholders in terms of resource collection. This has become a governance and security issue. While we should think about coping strategies, we have to resist a new rent-seeking game where politicians in threatened countries are awarded small amounts of aid in lieu of damages caused to them by global warming. We have seen over the last 4.5 years how much money has been, spoiled by the government leaders. The money we got from different development the donor partners as a part of the adaptation measures. So there has been a huge scandal about this usage of this money. This activity diverts our attention from the real challenges of development and would not help us if the worst were to happen. On the other hand, if we can develop broad domestic competitive capabilities, our people would be able to gradually move and claim new territory to live on if the worst were to happen. Bangladesh, in the meantime, should follow the strategy to grow and industrialize in the greenest possible way. There are therefore important environmental issues that we need to deal with, including assessing sustainable strategies of development and dealing with problems of river waters and other issues that are not directly connected with global warming. Thank you.
Thank you. That was excellent. A good overview of the whole issues. Walk beside me and be my friend. I like that. With that, I'll turn it over to Milan.
Thank you, Andrew. And thank you, General Munir and ASP for the invitation to speak today. It's a rare opportunity in DC to get to study Bangladesh in depth like this at a conference. So really thank you, ASP and General Munir for organizing this event today. Today I'd like to offer some of my personal thoughts on 4 aspects of Bangladesh's neighborhood ties: relations with China, India, the United States, and the issue of transit as it relates to Myanmar and implications for Bangladesh. First, regarding China, my view is that there is a certain amount of hype regarding this bilateral relationship, perhaps more so from those who are alarmed by the prospect of growing ties, but then there really isn't that much there either for those who want to see more Chinese development projects for the betterment of Bangladesh. Even though relations were rocky starting in 1971, China has since become Bangladesh's top supplier of military equipment and the largest supplier of imports to the country, according to some estimates. As Mr. Mahfouzallah mentioned, the arms deal with Russia is a very interesting development in January, and we're all going to wait to see how that plays out. But regarding China, I don't quite see a string of pearls notion developing where China is seeking a node of influence in Chittagong, as has been discussed for years. It's not suited for a deep water port development, and it's too silted. Sonadia has emerged in the discussion maybe in the past couple years about that being an alternative pearl, and it is suited for deep water port development. But interestingly, the idea of consortium development has been proposed. It's not really clear if it's coming from China or Bangladesh. Maybe it's a combination of both, but this idea of inviting other nations to contribute to the development of Sonadia, and we're seeing a development elsewhere in the region with regard to China's development projects, and it makes me wonder whether China is learning from its previous experiences in building Gwadar in Pakistan and Hambantota in Sri Lanka, now that it's entering its second decade of building these major infrastructure development projects in South Asia. Does consortium development perhaps make the project seem less sinister or menacing, and gives Bangladesh certainly more room to maneuver with regard to seeking investment opportunities from other countries? So I think it's a development worth watching. But from what I followed as an outside observer, I'm not seeing any forward movement with regard to the Sonadia project, as we've seen with some other major Chinese projects in South Asia. The Chinese ambassador to Bangladesh has mentioned from time to time China's interest, and CHEC, China Harbor Engineering Company, has an office in Dhaka, but I'm not really seeing any indicators of progress for this project, at least in the public domain. Similarly, the project to connect Chittagong with Kunming, connecting Bangladesh to China through Myanmar and India, I'm not seeing any indicators of progress for that project, in the public domain. But on the other hand, there are these more mundane, less strategically exciting projects that China is pursuing that are worth pointing out, like building the fertilizer factory in Sylhet. It's actually the second largest investment in Bangladesh behind India. And China is also planning on building more bridges and also a water treatment facility in Bangladesh. And my point is that the country has a lot of infrastructure needs. It has old roads and bridges that aren't really suited for cargo transport. And so my personal view is that it's actually a good thing that China is filling at least part of this need, because Bangladesh could use these enhancements in its connectivity. We often hear about how South Asia is among the least integrated regions of the world. So in the absence of seeing any menacing intentions, I think China and its state-owned enterprises should continue to pursue more development projects in Bangladesh to increase connectivity within South Asia and also with Southeast Asia. Now turning to Bangladesh's relations with India, I think the fact they're neighbors, that breeds tensions. This is a development that we've seen in India's relations with Sri Lanka and even Maldives to some extent. There are certainly troubles with border security, as we've seen with the recent acquittal of a border security force soldier in the Fulani trial. Also the land boundary agreement that has not yet been ratified in India. And water security concerns exist over agreements and dams. Despite having 54 rivers in common, the two countries have only signed one water sharing agreement, the Ganges Treaty. And they appear close to signing an agreement over the Tista and the Feni rivers in 2011 with Prime Minister Singh's visit to Dhaka. That was not to pass. The Chief Minister of West Bengal, Mamata Banerjee, she voiced her objection to that. And this agreement, it fell victim to the larger phenomenon, which is the rise of regional politics in India, and this current low point in Delhi's ability to conduct its foreign policy with a free hand, given its electoral interests. So I think this is more the reason for its failure than bilateral relations between the capitals not being on the same page. Also, many dams are being proposed in India's northeast, especially on the upper reaches of the Brahmaputra or the Jamuna, as it's known in Bangladesh, which is the single largest source of fresh water for Bangladesh. And I think the Deepening Dam project in Manipur state, this really symbolizes the difficulties in water management between the two countries. India sees this project as being vital to controlling floods and generating hydroelectric power, but Bangladesh sees it as drying up critical rivers which provide water to districts that provide the bulk of the country's rice crop. So there are certainly some difficulties in bilateral relations, but I think there also have been some positive steps that have been made. India has expressed gratitude over the counterterrorism cooperation between the two countries. Dhaka has cracked down on insurgents using Bangladesh as a base for operations in India. We heard earlier today that it sounds like there's still a way to go. There's more efforts that need to be made, but this is definitely development that Delhi has expressed gratitude to Bangladesh for. Secondly, the fact that Dhaka and Delhi have actually concluded draft agreements over water sharing and the land boundary agreement, I think that is progress worth noting. Now it's at the stage where it's a matter of Delhi seeking internal political accord, which is a natural next step in any international agreement. But it's easy to be pessimistic about these matters, and I think these things take time, but I think these are definitely steps forward that are worth noting. Also, with regard to the controversial Deepening Dam project proposed in Manipur, India has actually offered Bangladesh a stake in it. And Bangladesh has succeeded in delaying the project for about 2 years to conduct more surveys to assess the impact on the environment. But I think it'll be interesting to see if and how Bangladesh responds to this offer of having a stake in this project that has been so controversial. Also, India has pledged to invest $1 billion in loan deals for infrastructure development in Bangladesh, which is the largest investment in Bangladesh or any South Asian country. Also, we've seen some cooperation on power. President Mukherjee actually thanked Bangladesh for allowing the transport of heavy machinery across the country to set up a power plant in Tripura. And just a few days ago, Bangladesh has begun importing electricity from a grid in India. And finally, we've seen some progress with regard to port access, with Bangladesh now allowing the use of Mongla and Chittagong ports to move goods to and from India. And one recommendation for deepening bilateral ties that's on a slightly different track that we found at our research at CNA, and I'd actually like to acknowledge one of my co-authors on that effort, Dr. Satula May, who's in the audience here. But it's through defense cooperation in the maritime realm. India's longest border is with Bangladesh, and securing the land border and cooperating on counterinsurgency operations, that's obviously taken priority over building Navy-to-Navy relations. But the issues aren't as contentious as on the land or with border forces. So deepening these ties would help establish the habits of cooperation between the naval forces of the two countries. And as we heard today from Shafkat Munir, there is certainly a need that Bangladesh has in the maritime domain. It has problems with sea robbery or piracy, trafficking, illegal fishing, and following Bangladesh's victory in the Itlos area over the EEZ. Now EEZ is expanded, as has its responsibilities for the EEZ. And Bangladesh in particular needs help on search and rescue and getting hardware too, platforms like frigates and maritime patrol craft. And it's clear that Bangladesh doesn't really expect that kind of hardware from India, but yet India has definitely made strides in providing hardware to its other neighbors, such as Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. And even Sri Lanka has, obviously difficult relations over Tamil Nadu and illegal fishing. So I think that, this could be an opening for deepening bilateral relations through sort of this low-hanging fruit of Navy-to-Navy relations. Another way to do so would be if India could consider adding Bangladesh to a new maritime security agreement that it recently signed with Sri Lanka and Maldives. And that includes cooperation on search and rescue, marine pollution, and the surveillance of EEZs, all issues on which Bangladesh's Navy and Coast Guard could use help on. And this agreement actually grew out of SAARC, and that could be a rare accomplishment for SAARC, which, as we've heard today, it has generally disappointed. And just finally, since we're in Washington, I have to point out the robust political and military cooperation between Bangladesh and the United States. Even a couple years ago, we've seen the birth of the Partnership Dialogue and the Political Military Security Dialogue and their annual follow-ups this year. Also, the U.S. has transferred one of its Coast Guard cutter ships, the Jarvis, which is now the largest ship for Bangladesh, the Samudra Joy. And also the U.S. has transferred 6 high-speed boats for the Coast Guard. Also, the U.S. conducts the Tiger Shark exercise, and just a couple weeks ago concluded the Carrot exercise, which is actually really a Southeast Asian exercise, but Bangladesh is the only South Asian country in that exercise series. And then, of course, disaster relief. The U.S. has provided vital disaster relief to Bangladesh after Cyclone Marian hit in 1991, and then as recently as Cyclone Sidr, after that cyclone struck in 2007. So there's really just robust cooperation between the United States and Bangladesh. Finally, with regard to Myanmar and the transit issue, transit has definitely been a difficult issue in Bangladesh, although some consider it to be less the case right now, but still it's difficult. But I think it's important for Dhaka, regardless of who wins the upcoming elections, to not use its transit trump card to its detriment. India certainly needs transit across Bangladesh, and Dhaka, wants to justifiably and understandably use transit as leverage, especially with regard to the TISTA agreement. But I think it runs the risk of losing out in the long term if it, considering all this excitement over Myanmar and the opening there, and the proposed infrastructure development projects there, such as the Asian Highway, I think it runs the risk of being bypassed due to this excitement over Myanmar. And there have been a couple examples where the projects actually have bypassed Bangladesh. So I think it needs to really consider its long-term interest in terms of developing infrastructure that will help increase its integration within South Asia and with Southeast Asia. And I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion.
Malvi, thank you. That was an excellent look at how Bangladesh integrates or doesn't integrate with this region. I'm shocked that the Chinese string of pearls is overhyped. Shocked, I tell you. With that, I'll turn it over to Elizabeth Ferris.
Thank you very much, and thanks for hanging in there. I'm conscious of the fact I'm the last speaker after a long day, and so I think I'll be somewhat informal and talk about the relationship between climate change and displacement in Bangladesh, really picking up on some of the comments you made, Marcus. I should say I'm not an expert on Bangladesh. My expertise is in internal displacement, natural disasters, conflict, and so forth. And yet Bangladesh, in many ways, for those of us working in the field, is one of the countries most vulnerable in the whole world for the effects of climate change. Vulnerability is always a combination of the natural hazard, the force of the storm, the extent of sea level rise, and questions of governmental capacity, resilience of communities. It's always an interaction between natural phenomena and the way in which a society organizes to respond to this. Globally, the estimates are that somewhere between 200 million and 1 billion people will move by the year 2050. If you could look at this literature, kind of modeling that goes on to determine the extent to which people will be forced to move, a lot of it's pretty speculative. A lot of these models simply look at how much land mass is close to the sea, project a sea level rise of 1 meter or 2 meters, given such and such a rise in temperature, and assume that everybody living in those areas will move. They don't take into consideration a lot of adaptation techniques that can go on, and some perhaps a mitigation that will also occur. Movement of people likely to take three forms. Migration, people decide it's time for me to leave, see the handwriting on the wall, things are getting bad, I want a better future for my children, so I'll move, I choose to move. Secondly, there's displacement, people are forced to move, they don't have any choice. So you see this frequently in sudden onset disasters when the floodwaters come and your house is submerged. Your decision to leave is not a voluntary one, you have to move. So we've got migration, displacement, and the third one that Bangladesh I don't think has done very much on at all is the whole idea of planned relocations. If there are some areas that become uninhabitable because of the effects of climate change, then the humane thing to do is to move people in dignity and safety to places where they are safer. In fact, that area is likely to become a big area throughout the world, but very few governments are taking steps, as you might imagine, to plan for those kinds of moves. In terms of Bangladesh, if you look at natural hazards, the effects of climate change are likely to include increased temperatures, more monsoon rain, more riverbank erosion, but some of that might be mitigated by increasing sedimentation coming down to the rivers, maybe actually building up riverbanks in parts of the country. More intense cyclones, more severe droughts, more coastal erosion, and more unpredictable sudden onset disasters. All of this will affect food production, water supplies, health, and especially livelihoods, which are key to understanding the movement of people in most places. Sea level rise already occurring may alter the sediment balance, salinity of water, and soil in coastal regions, threaten freshwater supplies, fishing stocks, livelihoods, etc. But climate change, most of all, and I think Andrew mentioned this, is really aggravating existing environmental realities in Bangladesh and elsewhere. Flooding currently displaces between 500,000 and 1 million Bangladeshis every year. According to the World Bank, once every 3 to 5 years, 70% of Bangladesh is inundated by floods. A major cyclone hits on average every 3 years. You know, these have long been part of Bangladesh's history. And in fact, climate change seems to be exacerbating that rather than creating something fundamentally new. It is very difficult to determine to what extent climate change is leading people to move versus other environmental and economic factors that have always been push factors, if you will, for migration or displacement. Climate change seems to multiply pre-existing stressors. We know from other parts of the world that those most affected tend to be those who are poorest, most marginal, who live on the most marginal land, have the fewer resources, social capital, etc. A colleague of mine, actually in Australia, did some research on climate change in Bangladesh, and she used a really nice analogy that actually came from a Bangladeshi official she interviewed. And she said, imagine you're talking to a man who's carrying a load of 40 kilograms on his shoulder, and that is the maximum he can carry. He's using every bit of his energy, his strength, his will to carry those 40 kilograms on his shoulders. So 1 additional kilogram is added to this stack of 40, and the man collapses and dies. Do you say it's the 1 kilogram, the climate change effect, on top of the 40 kilograms that's caused his death? Or is it that 40 kilograms of this almost unbearable load he had to carry before the effects of climate? It's hard to determine to what extent is climate change pushing people over the brink. What we know about displacement is, first of all, it's likely to be internal, that most of those who are forced to leave their homes and communities will probably move to other places inside Bangladesh. It's likely to occur multiple times. One study on riverbank erosion, for example, found that the average was that people moved a kilometer away. If they didn't plan, they left when they had to. They moved very, very quickly. Cyclical and seasonal migration have been part of Bangladesh's history for eons, but it's likely to increase and likely to become more permanent. What we think we know is that sudden onset disasters like floods and cyclones tend to lead to massive but temporary displacement. Floodwaters come, people run away in large numbers, floodwaters subside, and a lot of people, as many as can, return. But when livelihoods are affected, which tends to happen more often in slow onset disasters, the migration tends to be permanent. And if you lost your way of life, your fishing, your agriculture, you can't do that anymore. Your migration tends to be longer term and protracted. And here as a political scientist, I have to say that politicians the world borders over need to be able to respond to those sudden onset disasters. Obama had to go to New York and New Jersey when Hurricane Sandy. You have to be shown to be responsive. But slow onset disasters, which may have a longer term and deeper impact, are a whole different kettle of fish. From a political perspective, to address slow onset disasters when the results won't be seen during your term, maybe not even during your lifetime, requires a kind of commitment that very few political leaders at any country have. You see what I mean? The political impetus is to respond to something that's going to hit tomorrow, not to something that's going to happen in a generation. There's been a lot of hype about cross-border displacement, terms like climate refugees, pouring over borders. Some of this is likely to occur. In the case of Bangladesh, this is generally true across the world, the poorest people can't do it. They don't have the resources to make it to a border, to have the social capital, to even begin to move. It's not the most destitute of people who move. And in fact, as I said, because of ties to the land, family links, resources, most people will be displaced internally. There are every year people displaced from Bangladesh into India. The Indian government talks about 20 million illegal Bangladeshis. There are very few statistics on how many people are actually crossing, particularly when most of this is undocumented. However, it is likely that highly skilled professional and business migration from Bangladesh will increase to other countries as conditions worsen in the country, as more people pour into Dhaka as a result of climate-induced factors. What's to be done? Bangladesh is one of the world leaders in disaster risk reduction. You look at the number of initiatives that the Bangladeshi government has taken over years to develop better early warning systems, and build up embankment and invest in infrastructure and develop popular education campaigns and construct shelters. And you look at the graph showing number of casualties from cyclones. I mean, it's something to behold. You remember 1970, cyclone killed 500,000 people. You know, the last cyclone killed less than 500. You know, in terms of the investment in disaster risk reduction, I think Bangladesh is one of the top 1 or 2 countries in the world. Looking a little bit, Bangladesh also last year passed a comprehensive disaster management law, which is a good law. I mean, this is something that people have been calling for a long time. I mean, some struggles in implementation, but that seems to be universal. In terms of its climate change strategy and action plan, which Bangladesh has developed, there are 3 action points related to migration. One for a monitoring mechanism, which all governments would do well, including the U.S., to monitor the movement of people resulting from climate change. A protocol to provide adequate support to them when people are forced to move, and capacity building through education and training. Very little attention given to the impact of climate change in urban areas. Indeed, of 15 action points in the NAPA, as it's called, of Bangladesh, only 1 refers to urban areas. But people who move to urban areas, poor people who move to urban areas, tend to live in the most vulnerable parts of those urban areas, more susceptible to effects of climate change. More attention to things like alternative livelihoods for people who are forced to leave their communities would be very helpful. I personally have always been struck by the large amount of land that is lost in South Asia generally as a result of riverbank erosion. And there's little attention, much more attention to cyclones and the big drama disasters and that steady, slow impact of riverbank erosion, which permanently removes, destroys national territory and displaces people who live here. Thank you.
Elizabeth, thank you. This is great. What a great panel. We've got almost 20 full minutes for discussion and questions. And I think throughout the panel, we've got some good ideas and some points for robust discussion. I'm going to take the moderator's privilege and ask the first question, and then I'll open it up. Just something is not a Bangladesh expert. It strikes me that a lot of the problems that a lot of the 3 of you talked about are really about Bangladesh not being as integrated with its neighbors and its region as it could be. And a lot of the proposals that you talked about of bringing it together are integrating it with its neighbors, big neighbor of India, or talk about power or transit rights, or also with China or Myanmar, talk about, trans-border migration, that sort of stuff. So maybe is that something, am I right on that? Is there a possibility for better integration with neighbors?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a possibility, and hopefully that will take place through infrastructure development projects. The country, it needs better roads, better bridges, better ports, and I think there's a lot of potential in South Asia, but there needs to be a commitment to getting these projects done, and then a political willingness to kind of push these through the bureaucracy, which isn't in the public eye, but I'm sure there are many people who are trying to do this, but trying to get it through all the other hurdles, as we heard today about corruption and all those other types of issues.
It seems like water and electricity are things that don't necessarily recognize borders very well. Mahfouz?
Yeah. Before I respond to your query, I would like to disagree with 2 of the points, if I have got it correctly. One made by Nilanthi and the other by Elizabeth. Nilanthi said that because the Tista and the transit issue, Tista and transit issues are independent of each other. This you must not forget. Tista is the water sharing, and we have being the lower riparian country, we have right to the waters of Tista. We don't want the whole of Tista water. We want an equitable sharing so that we can have it. This is our right, internationally accepted. This is Tista. But the other issue is not transit. India wants a corridor, because by definition it's a corridor, because India wants to transfer its goods from her own part to the other part of the country using Bangladesh. So that's a different equation, a different bargain, and a different thing. So if you confuse Tista and corridor and say that, okay, these are, interchangeable issue, that's not, is a very correct representation of the whole thing. The other thing, Elizabeth said that, what about the planned relocation of the people being affected by the sea level rise? Here I think Bangladesh is a very critical phase of thinking, because Bangladesh has a very sad experience with planned relocation of people. In the 80s, we relocated people in the Chittagong hill tracts. Those were victims of the riverbank erosion. And you won't believe that every year, 1 million people become victims of riverbank erosion in Bangladesh. I didn't go into details of those issues intentionally because of the time. And we had this very sad experience of relocating these riverbank victims in the in the hill tracts. And after that, what happened in the hill tracts, I think all of you are aware of it. People went to India, then there was the insurgency and all sorts of things. Then coming to your point, that when you say that whether possibility of better integration is there or not, definitely there is a possibility of better integration, but that depends, to me, that depends absolutely on the Indian interest. Just in the morning we were all talking about cross-border terrorism and all these things. Bangladesh government, the present Bangladesh government has publicly declared that it's our zero tolerance policies for all the extremist outfits of India, and we are not, and both the political parties have promised, the present government has implemented it, that we will not allow any extremist organization of India to use the soil of Bangladesh for actions against India. Unfortunately, 2 days before, the Director General of the Border Security Force of India, he claimed publicly that there are still 35 Indian terrorist outfits based in India from which they are operating. If this is the level of accusation, and on the other hand, when you talk of that, okay, this is a sort of a peaceful relationship, and you are saying that Elizabeth pointed out to that issue that India claims there are more Bangladeshi citizens in Delhi and in other places. It's very difficult to agree at this point of time, because when you have the barbed fence along the border of Bangladesh and you go on killing anyone, I would repeat, being suspected of crossing into India, then how do you say that, hundreds and thousands of people have already crossed Bangladesh and settled in India? It could be an age-old issue, but it's not an issue of today, or it's not an issue of, in 1975, some of the people went there, and then didn't come back. So that is always a different issue. But today, number of people migrating from Bangladesh to India is very difficult. And here we must keep into consideration the demographic issue. So far, if you look at the Assam issue, you would see that people in Assam are saying that, okay, we must kick out the Bengalis coming from Bangladesh. Why? Because this demographic issue is also linked to religion, the reality which we cannot, ignore. And for more a collaborative relationship with India, okay, the neighbors of India, they do not challenge Indian sort of a, India wants to become the big brother. We don't want India as the big brother. We want India as the elder brother. So there is a question of perception. Whether India is ready to become our elder brother, fine, no problem. If India wants to become the big brother, there lies the problem.
Yeah, sure, very quickly.
Sure. I take Mr. Mahfouzallah's points. Definitely, TISTA and transit are independent issues. I think you have to acknowledge, though, that the leadership has been willing to use transit as leverage, and in that way they connected. But I agree, they're definitely separate issues. But with regard to the corridor argument, I think that is one view, that by allowing transit access that gives India a corridor, but there are plenty of international roads around the world, and Bangladesh could actually benefit through transit fees. So I think, you know, in the meantime, if you prevent this kind of connectivity from taking place, it's to the detriment of Bangladesh and potential infrastructure for the country.
I'm going to open it for questions now, so wait for the thing to come around and then we'll go. I see a bunch. So why don't we start with in the back there? Yeah.
Yeah, Kamru.
Yeah.
My question is to Neelanthi. Regarding
I'm
the...
sorry, identify yourself.
Oh, myself.
Yeah.
I'm Sardar Kamrun Hassan from the Department of Defense.
Thank you.
My question is to Neelanthi regarding the stake in Tipaimukh Dam. I mean, India is willing or thinking about giving some stake in Tipaimukh Dam to Bangladesh. What is the gain for Bangladesh in having stake in Tipaimukh Dam? Could you clarify?
Sure, yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, ostensibly, I think the attempt is on India's part to make Bangladesh feel part of the process and not be, you know, on the defensive, as you know, it has justifiable concerns about the impact of the dam on its environment. So I think it's an attempt to include them basically in a project that will affect their country. But so far, Prime Minister Singh has offered this to the leadership, but it's still under discussion, and I haven't seen anything, you know, in the news talking about what Bangladesh's response could be.
Okay.
Thank you.
Right down.
Two quick comments. The first one is along the line of Mahfuzullah's assertion. I'm basically showing my solidarity to a point that he made. Integration is a desirable state of regional relationship, there is no doubt about it. But there is an unequal power relations between India and its neighbors. I mean, India is that 6,000 pound gorilla in the neighborhood. And whenever we talk about integration, the terms of integration is usually stacked in favor of India, as opposed to in favor of Pakistan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, or Bangladesh. So I think that's a very important point that we need to understand. Secondly, I beg to disagree with Neelanthi's comment that Bangladesh could benefit from transit or corridor. There was no systematic study of the possible impact of transit on Bangladeshi infrastructure, whether our road conditions can take Indian transportation. There was no systematic study on the impact of transit on the security situation in Bangladesh, whether we are going to make ourselves vulnerable to terrorist groups as a result of that. And there's definitely no systematic study on the economic consequence of transit. So I think it's a very problematic assertion that somehow automatically transit will favor Bangladesh or benefit Bangladesh. I think that statement needs to be deconstructed on some level. Thank you.
Thank you. Neelanthi, do you want to respond? Or
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, I think that, you know, transit in and of itself is not, it's not a simple issue. It's not, you know, on the whole, integration is desirable, but I mean, I think you can work these things so Bangladesh can benefit. I mean, I don't think a state where Bangladesh lets its roads suffer for the long term when Myanmar is getting all of these projects. I don't know if that's really in its long-term interest. I mean, I agree with you about this elder-brother relationship with India and the smaller states of South Asia. I think it's definitely problematic, and Bangladesh shouldn't have to suffer from that dynamic. But when you think about the alternative outcome where Bangladesh doesn't get to benefit from any of the potential economic benefits from transit, that I just, you know, I just don't know.
down in front here. Hold on, it's coming. Yeah, coming to you. Yeah.
Okay, my question is Nilagri also. Now,
Exactly right.
no, I have a question for Elaine as well.
You're the light of
But
fire.
you know, you have mentioned a lot of projects, for which you think that Indo-Bangladesh relation should be on a different plane than what it is now. Like, India giving a credit of $1 billion. Okay, but do you know that most of this money, of course, they are project-based, but most of the money have not yet been released.
Right.
on the, so it appears negative impact on the people.
Right, 200
It
million
was
has
signed in
been released.
2010, and this is 2013.
Sure.
And most of the money has not yet been released. Whereas India is giving Afghanistan, I mean, I'm not against giving help to Afghanistan. Afghanistan needs everybody's help. $2 billion, you know, for building projects, peace projects, not for arms or ammunition. So, you know, I am always in favor of building peace projects instead of giving weapons, because weapons don't solve the problem. So India hasn't done anything like that in Bangladesh. Secondly, the transit issue, Mr. Piaskuri has already raised, is there have not been any scientific studies, especially about the environment. All these, you know, big trucks which will go through Bangladesh, polluting the environment. Already Bangladesh, you know, basically jammed with people and with our own vehicles and transportation.
Its
It
infrastructure
is already
needs to be,
polluted.
yeah, no, its
Yes, but
infrastructure
no,
needs
no,
to be
but
improved.
no study. So you see, people, I mean, I'm talking about the government. The government is very, very secretive, and their decisions are based on, they're very not transparent at all, because people are not aware on what basis these deals are being signed, how the people of Bangladesh are going to benefit from those projects. We have to know that. But you know, there are no such press releases, no discussion in the parliament, no analytical articles by anybody I have seen. This is one. And another, you have talked about the maritime cooperation, Navy cooperation, which will help Bangladesh. It's true that, you know, Bangladesh is, we have threats, security threats from the ocean, Bay of Bengal also, piracy and all that. But you see, our maritime boundary has not yet been demarcated. India has been actually lagging its feet in settling that issue. The maritime border with India is not yet demarcated.
I mean, South Talpatti is practically submerged. That decision will come for next year.
Yeah, but it has not come yet. But
Right, but it was 2014.
India's claim and our claim overlap.
Right, yeah, South Talpatti.
So
Yeah,
we don't know
it's
how to make
mostly,
the decisions.
it's
So
mostly
because that,
submerged.
How can there be a Navy cooperation? I don't understand. And about the climate change, Elaine, I mean, you have made a very, I should say, in-depth analysis about the impact of climate change, especially in a country like Bangladesh. And Bangladesh is not responsible for this global warming, but we are paying the prices. But I wish, Elaine, you would have in your presentation discussed more about the impact of this climate change on the women, because the women suffer more when, you know, they are impacted by the climate change. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And I'll just ask for quick finishing remarks from each of my panelists, no more than 1 minute each. So I'll go in reverse order.
Raise that.
We have I'm sorry, we have a hard deadline. I was told I have a hard deadline to finish at 3 p.m. So you can have discussions afterwards. So we'll go in reverse order. So Elizabeth, 1 minute, and then.
Yeah, two quick comments. One is that the impact of climate change on gender is tremendous in terms of changing roles, responsibilities, workloads, and a host of other things. Secondly, just on the whole issue of regional cooperation, I'm sorry I missed the discussion on SAARC, but it would be great if there were a regional institution that could foment cooperation, particularly on disaster response, which is generally much easier to get cooperation on that immediate need sort of thing. And we've seen in other regions like ASEAN it's become much stronger because of its ability to overcome some political differences. So maybe that's the way to reach. It's less than 60 seconds.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for your comments. I mean, I think it shows, you know, how difficult and controversial transit is in Bangladesh, and how interlinked this issue is with regard to relations with India. I mean, you know, I think we're free to disagree. I mean, I think improving transit access and connecting Bangladesh to the rest of the region is ultimately a good thing. But I agree with you. I mean, I think it's difficult, you know, just considering this backdrop of the elder-brother relations with India. It's very complicated.
Mahfouz, 1 minute?
Oh yeah, 1 minute. No, I think the issues raised about the climate change, it needs a whole day discussion. I mean, the issue raised by Professor Chaudhary from Bangladesh, this is not only the issue of the climate change. This is as a whole. Climate change is an area which is a cross-cutting, area. So it goes into all sorts of areas. So that's why it needs more detailed discussion, and not only a 40 minutes or 50 minutes session is enough. This is number one. Number two is Indo-Bangladesh. Going back to the Indo-Bangladesh relation, one question was raised at the back of the that about the Tipai Muk Dam and all these things. So we have very bitter sort of an understanding of the Indian position, because back in 50s of the last century, when India started to have the constructing this Farakka Dam, on the 12th of August, the then Prime Minister of India, Pandit Nehru, made a statement in 1962 in the Indian Parliament that Farakka in no way would affect the people of Bangladesh. But over the years we have seen. And the same statement, even with semicolon, full stop, everything, was repeated. The same words were repeated by Manmohan Singh when he gave the assurance to Bangladesh so far the Tipai Muk Dam was concerned. So we are not very sure whether Tipai Muk would ultimately benefit us or not. The last sentence is we definitely want friendship with India, but we have very unfortunate experience back in 2007 when we were almost begging rice to feed our people, and India promised to give us 500,000 tons of rice. They promised, the prices were fixed. After 15 days, they said, no, we don't give you the rice because we have to pay the extra, otherwise you don't get the rice. So this is the experience of the mutual relationship.
Thank you to my panel.